Marcus Williams sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, staring at the quarterly reports that painted a picture he refused to believe. His company, Freshmart Solutions, operated 370 grocery stores across 12 states, employed over 15,000 people, and generated billions in annual revenue. Yet somewhere between the polished boardroom presentations and the numbers on his computer screen, something had gone terribly wrong. Customer complaints had tripled. Employee turnover had reached an all-time high. Profit margins were shrinking despite aggressive cost-cutting measures. His executive team assured him everything was under control, that these were just temporary growing pains, normal fluctuations in a competitive market. But Marcus had not built his empire by ignoring his instincts. And, right now, every instinct screamed that he was being lied to. He had started Freshmart 23 years ago with a single store and a simple philosophy: treat employees like family, and they will treat customers like guests in their own home. Somewhere along the way, that philosophy had been buried under corporate policies, efficiency metrics, and profit targets. He needed to know the truth. He needed to see what was really happening in his stores. And the only way to do that was to go where nobody would recognize him, to become invisible, to work alongside the people whose names never appeared in boardroom meetings. What Marcus would discover in the next few weeks would shake him to his core and force him to confront the monster his company had become. Sometimes the biggest threat to a business is not the competition outside, but the rot growing from within. This is the story of how one crying cashier changed everything. The decision had been made late on a Friday evening after another frustrating meeting with his executive team. Marcus had asked pointed questions about employee morale and received nothing but polished corporate speak in return. His chief operations officer, Gerald Patterson, had actually used the phrase human capital optimization with a straight face. His VP of store operations, Linda Cho, had presented a slideshow filled with pie charts and bar graphs that supposedly proved everything was fine. The disconnect between what they were telling him and what the numbers showed was staggering. That night, Marcus drove home to his suburban estate, kissed his wife Jennifer goodnight, and sat alone in his study until 3 in the morning. He thought about his father, who had worked as a butcher in a small neighborhood grocery store for 40 years. His father had known every customer by name, had extended credit to families going through hard times, had taught Marcus that business was ultimately about people, not profits. When Marcus opened his first Freshmart, his father had been there on opening day, tears in his eyes, proud that his son had achieved something he never could. His father had made him promise one thing: never forget where you came from. Never forget the people who do the real work. Marcus had kept that promise for years. In the early days, he had worked every position in his stores. He had stocked shelves at 4 in the morning, operated registers during rush hours, cleaned bathrooms, unloaded delivery trucks. He had known his employees, attended their weddings, visited them in hospitals, helped them through personal crises. But as Freshmart grew from 5 stores to 50 to 500, that personal connection had become impossible to maintain. He had been forced to delegate, to trust others to carry on his philosophy. And now, looking at the reports spread across his desk, he realized that trust had been misplaced. The plan came together over the following week. Marcus would take a leave of absence from his CEO duties, citing health concerns that required him to step back temporarily. Gerald would assume interim leadership. Marcus would undergo a physical transformation that would make him unrecognizable to anyone who knew him. He would create a false identity with a manufactured employment history. He would apply for entry-level positions at several Freshmart locations and work there for weeks, experiencing firsthand what his employees dealt with every day. When Marcus presented this plan to Jennifer, she was not surprised. After 28 years of marriage, she knew her husband well enough to recognize when he had made up his mind about something. She did worry about his safety and his health. Marcus was 56 years old, had not done physical labor in years, and was proposing to work grueling retail shifts that would exhaust people half his age. But she also understood why he had to do this. She had watched him become increasingly frustrated and withdrawn over the past year, had listened to him vent about feeling disconnected from the company he had built. If this was what he needed to do to find answers, she would support him. The transformation took 3 weeks to complete. Marcus stopped shaving and let his normally well-groomed beard grow wild and unkempt. He dyed his hair from distinguished gray to muddy brown with streaks of gray. He traded his expensive suits for worn jeans, old t-shirts, and a weathered jacket he purchased from a thrift store. He bought a pair of cheap glasses from a pharmacy to replace his designer frames. He practiced changing his posture, slouching slightly, moving with less confidence. He studied how to speak differently, dropping some of his vocabulary, using different phrases and expressions. He created a backstory. Marcus Johnson, recently laid off from a warehouse job, struggling to make ends meet, desperate for any work he could find. His HR director, the only person besides Jennifer who knew about the plan, created the necessary paperwork. Marcus Johnson's employment application showed spotty work history, several gaps between jobs, no college education, no special skills. It was the kind of application that would normally be filtered out by automated systems or given only cursory consideration by hiring managers. But Marcus wanted to see how Freshmart treated candidates like this, whether his company gave fair consideration to people who were down on their luck and needed a second chance. The first store he targeted was location number 214, a Freshmart in a working-class neighborhood about 90 miles from company headquarters. He had never visited this store personally. According to corporate records, it was an average performer with typical metrics. Nothing exceptional, nothing alarming. Perfect for his purposes. Marcus arrived at the store on a Tuesday morning, application in hand, asking to speak with the hiring manager. The assistant manager, a tired-looking woman in her early 40s named Carol, took his application and barely glanced at it. She asked him 3 questions. Could he work nights and weekends? Did he have reliable transportation? Could he start immediately? When Marcus answered yes to all 3, Carol told him he was hired, starting the next day. The entire interview lasted less than 5 minutes. There were no questions about his qualifications, his work ethic, his goals, his character. Freshmart needed bodies to fill shifts, and Marcus Johnson was a body. That night, Marcus lay awake, simultaneously excited and anxious about what he was about to do. Part of him felt guilty about the deception. These people would think he was one of them, would confide in him, trust him, never suspecting that he was actually the man ultimately responsible for their working conditions. But another part of him knew this was the only way to learn the truth. People behaved differently around the boss than they did around their peers. If he walked into a store as Marcus Williams, CEO, everyone would put on their best behavior, hide problems, tell him what they thought he wanted to hear. As Marcus Johnson, nobody, he would see reality. His first shift began at 6 in the morning. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, as he always had at every job he had ever worked. The employee entrance was at the back of the store, next to the loading dock. He entered through a dingy gray door that opened into a narrow hallway with concrete floors and flickering fluorescent lights. The break room was a small, windowless space with a few tables, a refrigerator that hummed loudly, a microwave that looked like it had not been cleaned in months, and a bulletin board covered with overlapping notices about policy changes, mandatory meetings, and warnings about various infractions. The room smelled like old coffee and something vaguely sour. 6 other employees were in the break room when Marcus arrived, all preparing for their shifts. Nobody greeted him or even looked up. He found Carol, who handed him a name tag, a vest with the Freshmart logo, and a 3-page employee handbook. She told him to read the handbook on his own time, showed him how to clock in using a fingerprint scanner, and assigned him to work with Tom, the produce manager, for training. Tom was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a red face and perpetually damp hair. He spoke in short, clipped sentences and seemed annoyed at having to train someone new. He showed Marcus where the produce was stored in the walk-in cooler, demonstrated how to rotate stock, explained which items needed to be checked hourly for freshness. The training lasted about 20 minutes. Then, Tom handed Marcus a spray bottle and a rag and told him to start cleaning and organizing the produce displays. For the next 4 hours, Marcus sprayed and wiped vegetables and fruits, threw away items that had gone bad, rotated stock, restocked empty bins, helped occasional customers find items. The work was monotonous and physically tiring. His back began to ache from the constant bending. His hands were cold and damp from handling wet produce. But he kept working, observing everything around him. He noticed that the produce department was understaffed. Tom was supposed to be managing 3 other employees, but 2 had called in sick and 1 was on break, leaving just Marcus and Tom to cover the entire department. Customers asked questions that Tom answered curtly or dismissed entirely. Marcus watched a woman ask Tom about the organic selection, and Tom responded by pointing vaguely toward one corner and walking away while she was still talking. When Marcus asked if they should be more helpful to customers, Tom laughed bitterly and said they did not have time for hand-holding. During his lunch break, Marcus sat alone in the break room eating a sandwich he had packed from home. Other employees came and went, most looking exhausted despite it being only midday. He overheard conversations about scheduling problems, last-minute shift changes, managers who played favorites, customers who were rude and demanding. Nobody seemed happy. Nobody seemed engaged with their work. They talked about the job the way prisoners might talk about their sentences, counting down hours until freedom. One young man, probably in his early 20s, sat at the table next to Marcus and called his girlfriend. Marcus could not help but overhear the conversation. The young man was apologizing for having to cancel plans again because his schedule had been changed at the last minute. He was explaining that he could not afford to lose this job, even though he hated it, that he needed the money to pay for his classes at community college. His girlfriend was clearly upset, and the young man sounded defeated as he ended the call. He sat there for a few more minutes, staring at his phone, looking lost. Marcus wanted to say something, to offer encouragement or perspective, but Marcus Johnson had no standing to do that. He was just another struggling employee. So he said nothing and returned to work. The afternoon shift was worse than the morning. The store got busier as people stopped by after work. The checkout lines grew long because several cashiers had not shown up for their shifts, and managers were pulling people from other departments to operate registers. Marcus was sent to help bag groceries. He stood at the end of a checkout lane for 3 hours, loading customer purchases into plastic and paper bags, helping carry items to cars, retrieving carts from the parking lot. The work was mindless but exhausting. His feet ached. His back throbbed. His hands were raw from handling rough plastic bags. He noticed that the cashiers looked miserable. They scanned items mechanically, rarely making eye contact with customers, speaking only the minimum required words. One cashier, a woman in her 30s with dark circles under her eyes, looked like she was on the verge of tears for most of her shift. Marcus heard her supervisor, a young man who barely looked old enough to drink, criticize her for not smiling enough, for not pushing the store loyalty card aggressively enough, for not working fast enough. The supervisor stood behind her for several minutes, timing her transaction speed with his phone, then told her she needed to pick up the pace or face disciplinary action. Marcus felt his anger rising but forced himself to stay calm and observe. This was what he had come to see. This was the reality his employees lived with every day. After his shift ended at 3 in the afternoon, Marcus clocked out and walked to his car in the employee parking lot at the far corner of the property. He sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, processing everything he had witnessed. His company, the business he had built on principles of respect and dignity, was treating people like disposable machines. And this was just day 1. Over the following days, Marcus settled into a routine. He arrived early, worked hard, kept his head down, and observed. He learned the names of his co-workers and heard their stories. There was Denise, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs and was constantly exhausted. There was Robert, a military veteran with a bad back who had been denied accommodation requests multiple times. There was Keisha, a college student who was supposed to work part-time, but regularly got scheduled for 40-hour weeks, making it impossible to focus on her studies. There was Miguel, an immigrant who sent most of his paycheck back to his family in another country and survived on cheap ramen and day-old bakery items from the store. Every single one of them had complaints about management, about unfair policies, about feeling disrespected and undervalued. But they all felt powerless to change anything. They needed their jobs. They had bills to pay, families to feed, lives that depended on the small paychecks they received every 2 weeks. Speaking up meant risking termination. Complaining meant being labeled a troublemaker. So they suffered in silence and counted the hours until their shifts ended. Marcus also observed the management team. Carol, The assistant manager who had hired him seemed overwhelmed and defeated. She had been with Freshmart for 12 years, had worked her way up from cashier to her current position, and now looked like she regretted every decision that had led her here. She spent most of her time putting out fires, dealing with customer complaints, covering for absent employees, trying to meet impossible targets set by corporate. She never smiled. She rarely spoke to employees except to give orders or criticism. She looked like someone who had given up. The store manager, a man named Derek who was rarely seen on the floor, was worse. On the few occasions Marcus saw Derek, he was either in his office on conference calls or walking through the store with a clipboard, noting violations and problems that he would later use to berate his staff. Derek had been hired from outside the company 2 years ago, brought in specifically to improve efficiency and cut costs. He had accomplished both goals by slashing hours, eliminating positions, and implementing rigid policies that prioritized metrics over people. Employee morale under Derek's leadership had collapsed, but his numbers looked good on paper, which was all corporate headquarters cared about. On his 5th day at the store, Marcus witnessed something that would haunt him for weeks. He was restocking shelves in the cereal aisle when he heard raised voices from the front of the store. He walked toward the commotion and saw Derek standing at a checkout lane, berating a young cashier named Sarah in front of customers and other employees. Sarah was maybe 19 or 20 years old, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and tears streaming down her face. Derek was shouting at her about a shortage in her register drawer, accusing her of theft or incompetence, telling her she was being written up and might be terminated. Sarah was trying to explain through her tears that she had followed all procedures, that she did not understand how there could be a shortage, that she had never stolen anything in her life. Derek was not interested in her explanation. He wanted an example to be made, a message to be sent to other employees. Marcus stood there, watching this public humiliation, feeling his blood pressure rise. Every instinct told him to step forward, to reveal who he really was, to put Derek in his place, and comfort this terrified young woman. But he could not. Not yet. He had to see this through, had to document everything, had to understand the full scope of the problem before he could fix it. So he turned away, went back to his aisle, and continued stocking shelves while fighting back his own tears of rage and shame. That evening, Marcus drove home in silence. Jennifer took one look. Store 163 was located in a slightly more affluent neighborhood than the previous location, in a shopping center anchored by several chain restaurants and a movie theater. Marcus arrived on a Monday morning with the same nervous energy he had felt on his first day weeks earlier, though now he knew what to expect. The fear of the unknown had been replaced by the dread of the known. He understood now that each Freshmart location was its own ecosystem of dysfunction, managed by people who had either given up or had never cared in the first place. The employee entrance here was marginally better than the last store. The hallway was cleaner, the break room slightly larger, though it still had that same depressing atmosphere of a place where nobody wanted to spend time. Marcus clocked in using the fingerprint system and reported to the duty manager, a woman named Patricia who looked to be in her early 50s. Patricia had the weathered appearance of someone who had worked retail her entire life. Her eyes were kind but tired, and she greeted Marcus with a genuine smile that felt like a rare gift after weeks of hostile or indifferent management. Patricia assigned Marcus to the grocery department, working under a supervisor named James. James was in his mid-30s, former military based on his posture and the way he spoke, and he ran his department with precision and discipline. Unlike Tom from the previous store, James actually took time to train Marcus properly. He explained not just what to do, but why it mattered. He showed Marcus how to read inventory reports, how to identify which products were selling well and which were taking up valuable shelf space, how to arrange displays to maximize customer appeal. James treated the work with respect, and, by extension, he treated Marcus with respect. Working in this store felt different from the very first day. The employees here seemed less defeated, more engaged. Marcus noticed people greeting each other in the break room, sharing jokes, having actual conversations rather than just sitting in exhausted silence. During his first lunch break, an older woman named Gladys sat down across from him and introduced herself. She had worked at Fresh Mart for 18 years, had survived multiple management changes and corporate restructures, and still somehow maintained a positive attitude. She welcomed Marcus warmly, told him he could come to her if he had questions, and shared her homemade cookies with everyone in the break room. Marcus was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps not all of his stores were disasters. Perhaps some managers had managed to preserve the culture he had intended to create. But he also reminded himself to stay vigilant, to observe carefully before drawing conclusions. First impressions could be deceiving. Over the following days, Marcus learned the rhythms of Store 163. The morning shifts were relatively calm, with a steady flow of customers and adequate staffing to handle the workload. James ran his grocery team efficiently, assigning tasks clearly and adjusting assignments when needed. He checked in with his employees regularly, asking how they were doing, whether they needed help, if anything was bothering them. He actually listened to their responses and acted on their feedback. When Marcus mentioned that the ladder they were using to reach high shelves was unstable and potentially dangerous, James immediately ordered a replacement and barred anyone from using the old ladder until it was fixed. Patricia, the duty manager, operated similarly. She walked the floor constantly, not to spy on employees, but to stay connected with what was happening in the store. She helped bag groceries during rush periods. She backed up her cashiers when dealing with difficult customers. She knew her employees' names, asked about their families, remembered personal details from previous conversations. Under her supervision, the store felt less like a corporate machine and more like a community. But as Marcus spent more time there, he began to notice cracks in the facade. Patricia and James were fighting a constant battle against corporate policies and district management. They were required to keep labor costs below a certain threshold, which meant they were perpetually understaffed. They had to meet aggressive sales targets that required them to push products and services that customers often did not want. They had to implement corporate initiatives that made no sense at the store level but were mandated from above. They had to file endless reports, attend mandatory conference calls, and defend their decisions to people who had never worked a day in a retail store. Marcus saw the toll this took on both of them. Patricia often stayed hours after her scheduled shift ended, completing paperwork and handling problems that had arisen during the day. She frequently skipped breaks and worked through lunch. She spent her off days worrying about what was happening at the store, calling in to check on things, coming in on her days off when emergencies arose. James pushed himself just as hard, arriving early and staying late, covering shifts when people called out sick, sacrificing his personal life to keep the department running smoothly. They were good managers doing their best in a broken system, and the system was slowly destroying them. Marcus learned from other employees that Patricia had been hospitalized the previous year for stress-related health issues. James had gone through a divorce that he attributed partially to the demands of his job. They were burning themselves out trying to protect their employees from the worst of corporate dysfunction, and eventually, they would break. Marcus also discovered that not everyone at Store 163 was as competent or caring as Patricia and James. The store manager, Craig, was rarely present. He spent most of his time in his office or out of the store entirely, attending meetings at district headquarters or visiting other locations. When he was in the store, he focused almost exclusively on numbers. He cared about sales figures, profit margins, and operational metrics. He did not know most of his employees by name. He did not understand the daily challenges they faced. He evaluated everything through spreadsheets and reports that turned human beings into data points. Craig had been with Fresh Mart for 8 years and had risen through the ranks by consistently hitting his numbers. He was exactly the kind of manager corporate loved, efficient, analytical, focused on results. He was also exactly the kind of manager who created toxic work environments. His indifference to employee welfare created a vacuum that Patricia and James tried desperately to fill, but they could not be everywhere at once. On his 8th day at the store, Marcus was stocking shelves in the cereal aisle when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. 2 employees were talking in the next aisle, unaware that Marcus was nearby. One of them was describing how she had been sexually harassed by a night shift supervisor. She had reported the harassment to Craig, providing specific details and witnesses. Craig had told her he would investigate. That had been 6 weeks ago. Nothing had happened. The supervisor was still working. The woman was still being harassed. She had complained again, and Craig had implied that she was being too sensitive, that she needed to develop thicker skin if she wanted to succeed in retail. The woman was in tears as she told this story to her coworker. She said she felt trapped because she needed the job, but could not continue enduring the harassment. She was afraid to go to HR because she had heard stories about people who complained and ended up being fired for unrelated reasons weeks later. She did not know what to do. Her coworker tried to offer comfort, but had no useful advice. They were both powerless against a system designed to protect the company rather than the employees. Marcus stood frozen in the cereal aisle, gripping a box of cornflakes so tightly it started to crumple in his hands. This was a failure of leadership at every level. The night shift supervisor should never have been allowed to harass anyone. Craig should have taken immediate action when the complaint was filed. The HR department should have intervened when Craig failed to act. And ultimately, Marcus himself was responsible because he had created the corporate culture that allowed this to happen. He had been so focused on growth and profits that he had stopped paying attention to the human cost of his success. That night, Marcus could not sleep. He lay awake thinking about that woman, whose name he did not even know, who was suffering because the company he had built had failed her. He thought about Sarah from the previous store, humiliated and driven out of her job. He thought about Denise working 2 jobs to support her children. He thought about Miguel sending money to his family while surviving on ramen. He thought about all the people whose lives were being damaged by policies and practices that bore his name. Jennifer found him at 2 in the morning, sitting in his study, staring at nothing. She asked what was wrong, and Marcus told her he wanted to quit the undercover operation, to reveal himself immediately and start fixing things. Jennifer listened patiently, then reminded him that he still had not achieved his goal. He had seen problems, yes, but he still did not understand the full scope of what was broken. If he revealed himself now, he would fix the obvious issues at 2 stores, but would remain blind to systemic problems affecting all 370 locations. He needed to complete the mission, as painful as it was, so that his solutions would be comprehensive rather than superficial. Marcus knew she was right, but the knowledge did not make it easier. He returned to work the next day, feeling like an imposter and a coward, watching people suffer while he took notes and gathered evidence. He forced himself to continue observing and documenting, telling himself that the temporary pain would lead to permanent change. Over the next week, Marcus paid closer attention to the harassment situation. He learned through careful listening and observation that the night shift supervisor in question was named Blake, that he had been with the company for 4 years, that he had a history of inappropriate behavior with female employees, and that management consistently looked the other way because Blake was good at his job and consistently hit his targets. Multiple women had complained about Blake over the years. None of the complaints had resulted in serious consequences. Blake would receive a verbal warning, would behave himself for a few weeks, then would return to his predatory patterns. The woman Marcus had overheard was named Amber. She was 24 years old, working at Freshmart while taking online classes to become a nurse. She was quiet and hardworking, the kind of employee any company should value and protect. Instead, she was being victimized and then abandoned by the very people who should have helped her. Marcus wanted desperately to intervene, but he knew that Marcus Johnson, ordinary employee, had no power to change anything. Only Marcus Williams, CEO, could do that, and he was not ready to reveal himself yet. He did, however, make sure to document everything. He noted dates, times, names, and specific incidents. He recorded conversations when legally permissible. He gathered evidence that would be useful when the time came to take action. He also made a personal promise that when he revealed himself, Blake would be the first person terminated, and Craig would be the second. As his time at store 163 continued, Marcus noticed other problems beneath the relatively positive surface. The store had higher morale than the previous location, but that was primarily due to Patricia and James fighting against corporate rather than because of corporate support. Employee wages were still too low. Benefits were inadequate. Scheduling was erratic. Opportunities for advancement were limited. The good managers were compensating for systemic failures, but they could not fix everything. Marcus also noticed that younger employees were particularly struggling. Many of them were working at Freshmart while attending school, trying to build better futures for themselves. But the demands of the job made it nearly impossible to focus on their education. Schedules changed constantly, making it difficult to plan study time or attend classes regularly. Managers showed no consideration for academic responsibilities, treating school as a hobby rather than a priority. Several employees had been forced to choose between keeping their jobs and continuing their education. Most had chosen the job because they needed the income, effectively trapping themselves in low-wage retail work with no path forward. One evening, Marcus was working a closing shift when he met a young man named Terrence. Terrence was 19, tall, and athletic, with dreams of playing college basketball. He had talent and had received interest from several schools, but his family could not afford the expenses not covered by athletic scholarships. He was working at Freshmart to save money, but between his job and helping his mother take care of his younger siblings, he had little time for basketball. His skills were deteriorating. His opportunities were fading. He would probably end up working retail for years while his dreams slowly died. Marcus listened to Terrence talk about his situation during their break, and he felt a profound sense of failure. His company was not just failing to support employees, it was actively destroying their potential. These were not just workers. They were human beings with hopes and dreams and talents. They deserved better than what Freshmart was giving them. They deserved a company that invested in their futures rather than just extracting their labor. After 3 weeks at store 163, Marcus requested a transfer. He told Patricia he needed to move closer to family in another part of the state. She was disappointed to see him go, told him he had been a good worker, and wished him well. Marcus felt guilty lying to her. Patricia was one of the few genuinely good people in management, and she deserved better than the hand she had been dealt. When the time came to reveal himself and make changes, he would make sure people like Patricia were rewarded and protected. His next assignment was Store 72, located in a rural area about 2 hours from the city. This would be his third and final undercover location before he revealed himself and began implementing changes. He had been working undercover for 6 weeks now, and the physical and emotional toll was severe. He had lost weight from the physical labor and stress. He was exhausted all the time. His body ached constantly. But more than the physical suffering, the emotional burden of watching people suffer while pretending to be powerless was crushing his spirit. Jennifer suggested he end the operation early. She worried about his health and his mental state. But Marcus insisted on continuing. He felt he owed it to every employee in every store to fully understand their experience before attempting to fix it. He had come this far. He would see it through to the end. Store 72 would be his last stop, his final chance to see the company from the bottom before returning to the top. The drive to Store 72 took him through increasingly rural landscape. The shopping centers and suburbs gave way to farmland and small towns. The store itself was smaller than the previous locations, serving a community of maybe 15,000 people. It was one of the original Freshmart locations, opened 20 years ago when Marcus was still expanding beyond the city. He had not visited this store in over a decade. He arrived on a gray Monday morning, the sky threatening rain. The employee entrance was at the side of the building, opening into a narrow hallway that led to an even smaller break room than the previous stores. The walls were covered with yellowing notices and faded motivational posters. The furniture looked like it had been salvaged from somewhere else. The refrigerator wheezed and rattled like it might die at any moment. This store had clearly not received the same investment and attention as newer locations. Marcus clocked in and was greeted by the store manager, a woman named Susan who looked to be in her early 60s. Susan had kind eyes, but a weathered face that told stories of decades in retail management. She welcomed Marcus warmly, told him she was glad to have another set of hands, and assigned him to work in multiple departments as needed. The store was so short-staffed that employees had to be flexible, covering wherever the need was greatest on any given day. The first thing Marcus noticed was how old the staff was. At the previous stores, employees had ranged from teenagers to people in their 60s, but the majority had been younger workers. Here, Almost everyone was over 40, and many were significantly older. He learned through conversations that Store 72 had trouble attracting younger workers because wages were too low to compete with other opportunities in the area. The people working here were mostly those who had limited options, older workers who had been laid off from other jobs, people with criminal records who struggled to find employment elsewhere, individuals with disabilities who faced discrimination in the job market. These were people who needed Freshmart more than Freshmart needed them. And that power imbalance created a particularly toxic environment. Management knew these employees had nowhere else to go, so there was little incentive to treat them well or address their concerns. The unspoken message was clear: be grateful you have a job at all, because you could easily be replaced. Every person Marcus met at Store 72 had a story of struggle and resilience. They were not lazy or unmotivated. They were people who had been beaten down by circumstances, by economic changes beyond their control, by a system that valued profit over humanity. They came to work every day despite pain, exhaustion, and disappointment because they had responsibilities and people depending on them. They deserved respect and dignity, but Freshmart was giving them neither. The working conditions at Store 72 were worse than anything Marcus had seen at the previous locations. Equipment was old and poorly maintained. The building itself was falling apart, with leaking ceilings, broken tiles, and temperamental heating and cooling systems. The walk-in cooler frequently malfunctioned, putting perishable inventory at risk. The cash registers were ancient, constantly jamming and freezing. Requests for repairs or upgrades were routinely denied by corporate, which considered this location a low priority for capital investment. Employees made do with inadequate tools and dangerous conditions. Marcus watched Raymond climb a rickety ladder to reach items on high shelves because the store did not have a proper lift. He saw Linda forced to lift heavy boxes despite her mobility issues because there was nobody else available to do it. He saw Jorge clean spills with rags and mops that should have been thrown away months ago. Everyone accepted these conditions as normal because they had been this way for so long. The customer service suffered as a result. With inadequate staffing and exhausted employees, it was impossible to maintain the standards that Marcus had envisioned for his stores. Customers complained about long checkout lines, empty shelves, dirty bathrooms, and indifferent service. But, from the inside, Marcus understood that these problems were not the fault of the employees. They were working as hard as they could with the resources they had been given. The failure was in leadership, in corporate decisions that prioritized short-term savings over long-term sustainability and reputation. Marcus had been at Store 72 for just over a week when he witnessed the incident that would finally break his silence and end his undercover operation. It was a Thursday afternoon, and he was working the checkout lanes during a busy period. The woman operating the register next to him was named Catherine, someone he had spoken with several times during breaks. Catherine was in her mid-40s, a single mother of 2 teenagers, and had been working at Freshmart for 7 years. She was one of the most reliable employees in the store, always on time, always willing to take extra shifts, always maintaining a positive attitude despite difficult circumstances. Marcus noticed that Catherine looked particularly stressed that afternoon. Her eyes were red like she had been crying, and her hands trembled slightly as she scanned items. During a brief lull between customers, Marcus asked if she was okay. Catherine gave him a forced smile and said she was fine, but he could tell she was lying. Something was clearly wrong, but she was trying to hold herself together long enough to finish her shift. About an hour later, during another rush of customers, Catherine suddenly stopped scanning items. She stood motionless at her register, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. The customer in her line asked if something was wrong, but Catherine did not respond. She seemed to be in shock, completely disconnected from her surroundings. The customer became impatient and called for a manager. Susan appeared within moments, took one look at Catherine, and gently guided her away from the register while apologizing to the waiting customer. Marcus watched Susan take Catherine to the back office. He wanted to follow, to find out what had happened, to offer help in some way. But he was just another employee with a line of customers waiting, so he stayed at his register and continued working while worrying about Catherine. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. Every few minutes, Marcus glanced toward the back of the store, wondering what was happening with Catherine, whether she was okay. When his shift finally ended and he went to clock out, he found Catherine sitting alone in the break room. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she held a wadded tissue in her hands. She looked up when Marcus entered and tried to compose herself, apologizing for her behavior earlier. Marcus sat down across from her and told her she had nothing to apologize for. He asked if there was anything he could do to help. Catherine hesitated. Then, the story poured out of her in a flood of words and tears. Her daughter had been in a car accident that morning. She was alive, but had been taken to the hospital with injuries that required surgery. Catherine had received the call during her break, but when she told Susan she needed to leave immediately to be with her daughter, Susan had refused. The store was short-staffed, Susan explained, and they could not afford to lose Catherine during a busy shift. Susan had promised that Catherine could leave as soon as the evening shift arrived to provide coverage. Catherine had been forced to work for 4 hours knowing her daughter was in surgery, unable to be there, consumed with worry and guilt. She had tried to hold herself together, to keep working, but eventually the stress had become too much. The breakdown at the register was the result of hours of accumulated anxiety and fear. Susan had finally allowed her to leave, but the damage was done. Catherine had missed being with her daughter during one of the most frightening experiences of the girl's life because Freshmart valued coverage more than compassion. As Catherine told this story, Marcus felt something inside him snap. This was not just corporate dysfunction or poor management. This was cruelty. This was a fundamental failure of human decency. No policy, no staffing shortage, no business need could justify forcing a mother to work while her child was in surgery. The fact that this had happened in his company, under his name, was unforgivable. Marcus wanted to reveal himself right then, to tell Catherine who he really was, and that she would be compensated for what she had endured. But he restrained himself because he realized that this moment required witnessing, not intervention. He needed to understand exactly what had happened, what policies had been followed, what decisions had been made, and why. So he simply listened, offered what comfort he could as Marcus Johnson, and encouraged Catherine to go to the hospital immediately. Catherine thanked him through her tears, gathered her things, and left. After Catherine departed, Marcus went to find Susan. He found her in her office, surrounded by paperwork, looking even more exhausted than usual. When Marcus asked about what had happened with Catherine, Susan sighed deeply and rubbed her eyes. She explained that she had not wanted to make Catherine stay, that her instinct had been to send her to the hospital immediately. But corporate policy required her to maintain minimum staffing levels at all times. If she had allowed Catherine to leave, and the store had fallen below minimum staffing, Susan herself would have faced disciplinary action, possibly even termination. Susan had called the district manager to explain the situation and request permission to temporarily operate below minimum staffing. The district manager had refused, stating that policy existed for a reason and could not be waived for personal emergencies. The district manager had suggested that Susan herself cover Catherine's register if necessary, which Susan had been prepared to do. But before that could happen, the evening shift had arrived, and Catherine had been released. Susan was clearly troubled by what had happened. She kept justifying her decision, explaining that she had been following policy, that she had no choice, that she had tried to find a solution. But Marcus could see the guilt in her eyes. Susan knew she had done something wrong, had violated a basic principle of human decency, but she felt trapped by a system that punished deviation from policy regardless of circumstances. This, Marcus realized, was the core problem. Freshmart had created a system where good people felt compelled to do bad things because the rules left no room for humanity. Policies that might make sense in a spreadsheet became tools of cruelty when applied rigidly to real human situations. Managers like Susan, who genuinely cared about their employees, were forced to choose between compassion and compliance. The system was designed to prioritize the company over the individual in every situation, and employees like Catherine paid the price. That evening, Marcus drove to the hospital where Catherine's daughter was recovering. He did not go inside. He had no standing to visit as Marcus Johnson. But he sat in the parking lot for an hour, wrestling with his conscience and his anger. He thought about the long chain of decisions that had led to this moment. He had created Freshmart with good intentions, but somewhere along the way, his company had become something monstrous. Layer by layer, policy by policy, the humanity had been stripped away until all that remained was a machine that consumed people and produced profits. He called Jennifer from the hospital parking lot and told her everything. He told her about Catherine, about Susan, about the policies and the district manager and the complete failure of leadership at every level. He told her he was done with the undercover operation, that he had seen enough, that he could not stomach another day of witnessing suffering while pretending to be powerless. Jennifer agreed. It was time to end the charade and start fixing the problems. But Marcus did not reveal himself immediately. First, he needed to document everything he had witnessed to create an evidence file that would support the changes he planned to make. He spent the next 2 days at Store 72 working his shifts, but also recording observations, taking photographs of dangerous conditions, and having conversations with employees about their experiences and concerns. He spoke with Raymond about the manufacturing plant closure and his struggles to find decent work. He spoke with Linda about her denied accommodation requests and the physical pain she endured every day. He spoke with Jorge about being overqualified and undervalued, about dreams that had died because of circumstances beyond his control. Every conversation reinforced what Marcus already knew. The problem was systemic, not isolated to one store or one manager. From the smallest rural location to the largest urban store, Freshmart was failing its employees in fundamental ways. The company prioritized efficiency metrics over employee welfare, short-term profits over long-term sustainability, and corporate policies over human judgment. Good managers like Patricia and James were fighting against the system. Bad managers like Derek and Craig were thriving within it. And people like Susan were trapped in the middle, forced to implement cruel policies while hating themselves for doing so. On his final day at Store 72, Marcus arranged a meeting with Susan in her office. He told her he needed to discuss something important. Susan assumed he was quitting, which most new employees did within a few weeks of starting at this location. She was prepared to accept his resignation with the same weary acceptance she showed for all the other departures. Instead, Marcus closed the office door, sat down across from her, and revealed his true identity. He showed her his real driver's license, pulled up his official company biography on Susan's computer, and watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, shock, and, finally, terror. She immediately began apologizing, explaining, justifying every decision she had made during his time at the store. She assumed he was there to fire her, to punish her for the failures he had witnessed. Marcus stopped her mid-sentence. He told her he was not there to punish her, but to understand. He explained that he had been working undercover at 3 different stores for the past 8 weeks, that he had seen the problems throughout the company, that he understood she was a victim of the system as much as the employees she managed. He asked her to tell him honestly, without fear of repercussions, what it was like to manage a Freshmart store. Susan was hesitant at first, still afraid this was some kind of trap. But as Marcus continued to ask thoughtful questions and listen without judgment, she began to open up. She told him about the impossible demands placed on store managers, about being forced to meet contradictory goals with inadequate resources, about corporate policies that made no sense at the operational level, but had to be followed regardless. She told him about the toll the job had taken on her health, her relationships, her sense of self-worth. She told him she had considered quitting hundreds of times, but felt responsible for her employees and feared what would happen to them if she left. She also told him about Catherine. After Marcus had left the previous evening, Susan had gone to the hospital herself to check on Catherine's daughter. The girl would recover fully, but Catherine had been cold and distant when Susan arrived. Susan had tried to apologize, to explain that she had been following corporate policy, that her hands had been tied. Catherine had simply looked at her and said that she understood Susan had been following rules, but that did not change the fact that Susan had chosen to enforce those rules. Catherine said she would never forget being forced to work while her daughter was in surgery, and that no policy could justify that choice. Susan had left the hospital in tears, had gone home, and seriously considered quitting. Only the knowledge that her employees depended on her had brought her back to work the next morning. She told Marcus that the Catherine situation had broken something in her, that she could not continue managing this way, that she would either find a different approach or find a different job. Marcus listened to all of this, and when Susan finished, he made her a promise. He was going to change Freshmart from the ground up. He was going to eliminate the policies that forced good managers to make bad decisions. He was going to empower people like her to use their judgment and compassion. He was going to fire managers who abused their power. He was going to invest in stores, equipment, training, and people. And he was going to make sure that what happened to Catherine never happened to anyone else. He also told Catherine that he wanted to compensate her for what she had endured. He offered her a significant financial payment to cover her daughter's medical bills and compensate for the trauma of that day. Catherine was silent for a long time, staring at him with an expression he could not read. Finally, she spoke. She told him she did not want his money. What she wanted was for him to ensure that no other mother ever had to make the choice she had been forced to make. She wanted policies changed so that managers had the authority to respond to genuine emergencies with compassion rather than rigid adherence to staffing requirements. She wanted Freshmart to be the kind of company that valued its employees as human beings, not just as resources to be managed. Marcus promised her that would happen. He asked Catherine if she would be willing to meet with him again in a few weeks, to provide input on the policy changes he was developing, to help him understand from a frontline employee's perspective what needed to change. Catherine agreed, but she made it clear that she would judge him by his actions, not his promises. Fair enough, Marcus thought. That was exactly what he deserved. The drive back to corporate headquarters took 3 hours, and Marcus spent the entire time organizing his thoughts. He had filled several notebooks with observations during his 8 weeks undercover. He had photographs of dangerous equipment and deteriorating facilities. He had recorded conversations with employees describing their experiences and concerns. He had documented specific instances of management failure, policy dysfunction, and corporate negligence. All of this would be compiled into a comprehensive report that would guide the transformation of Freshmart. When he arrived home that evening, Jennifer was waiting for him. She had prepared his favorite dinner, opened a bottle of good wine, and created a space for him to decompress and process everything he had been through. They sat together for hours, Marcus recounting stories and experiences he had not shared during his nightly phone calls. He told her about the people he had met, about their struggles and their resilience, about the fundamental goodness he had found in employees despite the dysfunction surrounding them. He also talked about his own transformation. 8 weeks of physical labor had changed his body. He had lost nearly 20 pounds. His hands were calloused. His back ached constantly. But more than the physical changes, the experience had fundamentally altered his perspective. He had been reminded that his employees were not just numbers on a spreadsheet or entries in a database. They were real people with real problems, with families and dreams and fears and aspirations. Every decision he made as CEO had consequences that rippled through thousands of lives. He could never again make those decisions from the detached perspective of the executive suite. Jennifer listened to everything, asked thoughtful questions, offered insights, and support. She told him she was proud of what he had done, that it took courage to voluntarily subject himself to the conditions his employees endured every day. But she also reminded him that the hard work was just beginning. Documenting problems was one thing. Solving them would be far more difficult. He would face resistance from executives who benefited from the current system. He would encounter skepticism from employees who had heard empty promises before. He would have to navigate the complex politics of corporate change while maintaining the company's financial viability. It would be the most challenging thing he had ever attempted. Marcus knew she was right, but he also knew he had no choice. He had seen too much to pretend everything was fine. He had made too many promises to people who were counting on him. The easy path would have been to return to his corner office, make a few superficial changes, and convince himself he had done enough. But Marcus had never taken the easy path. That was not how he had built Freshmart from a single store to a regional powerhouse. And it was not how he would save the company from the poison that had infected it. The following Monday morning, Marcus returned to corporate headquarters for the first time in 2 months. He had told his executive team he was taking medical leave, and They had been operating under Gerald's interim leadership during his absence. When Marcus walked into the building, the reception staff did a double take. He looked different, thinner and harder, with longer hair and an unkempt beard. He was wearing casual clothes rather than his usual suit. He looked less like a CEO and more like someone who had just come off a construction site. Gerald was in Marcus's office when he arrived, reviewing documents at the large desk. He looked up in surprise when Marcus entered without knocking. Gerald started to say something about not expecting Marcus back so soon, but Marcus cut him off. He told Gerald to clear his schedule for the rest of the week. They had important work to do. Gerald began asking questions, but Marcus simply repeated the instruction and walked out, heading to the conference room that would become his base of operations for the next several weeks. Over the following days, Marcus met individually with each member of his executive team. He did not tell them where he had been or what he had been doing. He simply asked them questions about various aspects of the business. How did they know if employees were happy? What mechanisms existed for frontline workers to communicate concerns to leadership? How were store managers evaluated? What happened when employees reported harassment or discrimination? How were decisions made about capital investment in older stores? The answers he received were revealing. Most of his executives had no real insight into employee morale beyond quarterly engagement surveys that were widely recognized as unreliable. Communication between frontline workers and corporate leadership was virtually non-existent. Store managers were evaluated almost entirely on financial metrics with little consideration for how they treated employees. Harassment and discrimination complaints went through an HR process designed more to protect the company from legal liability than to protect employees from harm. Investment decisions for older stores were made based purely on return on investment calculations that inevitably favored newer, more profitable locations. In other words, his executive team had created exactly the kind of system that Marcus had observed during his undercover work. They were not evil people. They were simply operating within a framework that prioritized efficiency and profitability over humanity and sustainability. They had lost sight of the fact that a company is not just a financial entity, but a community of people working towards shared goals. After completing his individual meetings, Marcus called his entire executive team together for a full-day session. He arrived at the conference room early and set up his materials, photographs from the stores, transcripts of conversations with employees, documentation of policy failures, and management abuses. When the executives arrived and took their seats, they found a very different Marcus Williams than the one they had known before. Marcus began by telling them exactly what he had been doing for the past 2 months. He showed them his notebooks filled with observations. He showed them photographs of dangerous equipment and deteriorating facilities. He played audio recordings of employees describing their experiences. He told them about Sarah, who had been humiliated at her register over a drawer shortage. He told them about Amber, who had been harassed and abandoned by management. He told them about Catherine, who had been forced to work while her daughter was in surgery. He told them about Raymond and Linda and Jorge and Denise and Miguel and Terrence and dozens of other people whose lives had been damaged by Freshmart's policies and practices. The room was completely silent as Marcus spoke. Some executives looked shocked. Others looked defensive. A few looked ashamed. When Marcus finally finished and asked for their responses, nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, Gerald, the interim CEO, cleared his throat and began to offer explanations. The company was facing competitive pressures. Margins were thin. They had to operate efficiently to survive. Every decision they had made was intended to protect the long-term viability of the business. Marcus let Gerald finish, then responded calmly but firmly. He agreed that the company faced competitive pressures and needed to operate efficiently. But efficiency that came at the cost of human dignity was not sustainable. A business model that burned through employees and damaged lives was not viable in the long term. The current approach was already showing cracks. High turnover meant constant training costs. Poor morale meant poor customer service, and deteriorating facilities meant lost sales. They were saving money in the short term, but destroying the company's foundation in the process. He told them about his vision for a different kind of Freshmart, one that invested in employees and treated them as assets rather than expenses. He acknowledged this would require significant changes, including some that would be financially painful in the short term. But he believed that over time, a company that took care of its people would outperform one that did not. Engaged employees provided better customer service. Lower turnover meant lower training costs and better institutional knowledge. Good working conditions attracted better talent. Treating people with dignity was not just morally right, it was good business. Linda Cho, the VP of Store Operations, spoke up. She challenged Marcus's assertion that the changes he was proposing would be financially viable. She presented data showing that labor was their largest controllable expense, that even small increases in wages or benefits would significantly impact margins, that competitors were following similar cost-cutting strategies. If Freshmart unilaterally chose to invest more in employees while competitors did not, they would be at a competitive disadvantage. Marcus acknowledged that Linda's concerns were valid. This was indeed a risk. But he argued that the race to the bottom in labor costs was ultimately self-defeating. If every company in the industry treated employees poorly, the entire industry would suffer from high turnover, low morale, and poor service. Someone needed to demonstrate that a different approach was possible. Freshmart would be that someone. If they failed, he would take responsibility. But he believed they would succeed. The discussion continued for hours. Some executives were supportive, seeing the wisdom in Marcus's approach. Others were skeptical or openly resistant. Gerald was particularly concerned about what this meant for his own position. He had been running the company according to one philosophy, and now Marcus was returning to implement the opposite approach. Where did that leave him? Marcus addressed Gerald's concerns directly. He told Gerald and the rest of the team that he was not interested in scapegoating anyone. The system had produced the outcomes it was designed to produce. The executives had been following incentives and metrics that Marcus himself had approved. But now those incentives and metrics needed to change. Anyone who was willing to embrace the new direction would have a place in the company's future. Anyone who could not or would not adapt would need to find opportunities elsewhere. It was that simple. Over the next several days, Marcus began implementing immediate changes. He created a new position, Chief People Officer, that would report directly to him and have equal standing with other C-level executives. This person would be responsible for employee welfare, workplace culture, and ensuring that corporate policies supported rather than undermined human dignity. He began a search for the right person to fill this role, looking for someone with both business acumen and genuine compassion for workers. He established a direct communication channel between frontline employees and corporate leadership. Employees could submit concerns or suggestions anonymously through a secure online portal. Every submission would be reviewed by a team that included the Chief People Officer, and responses would be provided within 72 hours. Employees who identified themselves would receive personal follow-up. This system would bypass the traditional chain of command that often suppressed bad news and protect whistleblowers from retaliation. He ordered immediate safety inspections at all 370 stores to be conducted by independent third-party experts rather than internal personnel. Any equipment or facility issues identified as dangerous would be addressed immediately, regardless of cost. Stores that required significant investment to meet safety standards would receive it. No more deferred maintenance. No more employees working with broken equipment or in unsafe conditions. He revised the harassment and discrimination reporting system. Complaints would now be investigated by an independent external firm rather than internal HR. Managers accused of harassment would be placed on leave during investigations. Any manager found to have harassed employees would be terminated immediately, regardless of their performance metrics. Any manager found to have ignored or suppressed harassment complaints would face similar consequences. The message needed to be clear. This behavior would not be tolerated at any level. He changed the employee scheduling system. Schedules would now be posted 3 weeks in advance instead of 1 week. Last-minute changes would require employee consent and would come with premium pay. Students would be given priority for scheduling around their class times. Parents would have consideration for school schedules and childcare needs. The rigid staffing algorithms that treated employees like interchangeable parts would be replaced with systems that acknowledged people had lives outside of work. He implemented an emergency leave policy. employees facing genuine emergency. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The employee communication portal received over 3,000 submissions in the first week. Some were expressions of support and gratitude. Many were reports of problems that had been festering for years. A few were skeptical or cynical, questioning whether Marcus would actually follow through on his promises. All of them were read and responded to as promised. The media picked up the story quickly. A CEO going undercover in his own company and then implementing major reforms based on what he learned was newsworthy. Marcus did several interviews where he spoke candidly about what he had discovered and why he was making changes. Some journalists were supportive, praising him for his courage and integrity. Others were skeptical, suggesting this was a publicity stunt that would fade once the headlines did. Business analysts were almost uniformly negative, warning that Marcus was jeopardizing shareholder value and putting the company at competitive risk. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. Several board members were furious that Marcus had implemented such sweeping changes without consulting them first. They argued that his responsibility was to shareholders, not employees, and that he was violating his fiduciary duty by prioritizing worker welfare over profitability. A motion was introduced to remove Marcus as CEO and replace him with someone who would protect shareholder interests. The board meeting was contentious and lasted for hours. Marcus made his case passionately. He argued that taking care of employees was not contrary to shareholder interests, but essential to them. A company that burned through workers and created toxic workplaces might show short-term profits, but it was not sustainable. Eventually, high turnover, poor service, and damaged reputation would catch up with them. The changes he was implementing were investments in the company's long-term viability. He also reminded the board that he was the largest individual shareholder and had built Freshmart from nothing. He had earned the right to determine its direction. If they disagreed with his vision, they were free to sell their shares. But he would not be bullied into abandoning his principles or his employees. The motion to remove Marcus failed, but barely. He survived with the support of just over half the board. The message was clear: he was on probation. If his reforms did not show results within a reasonable time frame, he would be out. Marcus accepted these terms. He had 90 days to prove that his approach could work. After that, the board would review performance and make a final decision about his future and the company's direction. The first few weeks after implementing the changes were chaotic. Store managers who had operated under the old system struggled to adapt to the new expectations. Some embraced the changes enthusiastically, relieved to finally have permission to treat employees humanely. Others resisted, either because they genuinely disagreed with the new direction or because they were afraid that showing compassion would be perceived as weakness. Marcus spent most of his time during this period visiting stores and meeting with employees and managers. He went to store 214, where he had started his undercover journey, and met with Carol and the other employees who had worked alongside Marcus Johnson. Their reactions were mixed. Some were angry about the deception. Others were grateful that their experiences had led to real change. Carol, the exhausted assistant manager who had hired him, was cautiously hopeful. She told Marcus that she wanted to believe things would be different, but she had been disappointed too many times before. He went to store 163, where Patricia and James had been fighting to maintain humanity within a broken system. Both were thriving under the new policies. With proper staffing levels and reasonable expectations, they could finally manage the way they had always wanted to. Patricia looked healthier and happier than Marcus had ever seen her. James reported that employee morale in his department had improved dramatically. People were starting to believe that Freshmart might actually be a good place to work. Marcus also addressed the situation with Amber, who had been harassed by the night shift supervisor Blake. The independent investigation confirmed everything Amber had reported and revealed that Blake had harassed at least 5 other women during his time with Freshmart. Blake was terminated immediately. Craig, the store manager who had ignored Amber's complaints, was also fired for failing to protect employees and violating the company's values. Amber was offered a settlement that included back pay, compensation for emotional distress, and a guarantee that she could continue working at Freshmart without fear of retaliation. She accepted and chose to stay with the company. The changes at Store 72 were particularly dramatic. Marcus approved a major renovation of the facility, bringing it up to the standards of newer stores. He replaced all the aging equipment. He hired additional staff, so Susan would no longer be running the store alone. He established a maintenance budget that would ensure problems were addressed promptly rather than deferred indefinitely. The transformation of this location became a symbol of Freshmart's commitment to investing in all stores, not just the most profitable ones. Susan, the overwhelmed manager who had been forced to implement cruel policies, flourished with proper support and resources. She told Marcus during one of his visits that she felt like she was managing a different store. Employee morale was higher. Customer satisfaction scores were improving. People actually seemed to enjoy coming to work. She thanked Marcus for keeping his promise and admitted that she had not really believed he would follow through. But he had, and it had made all the difference. Raymond, the former manufacturing worker, told Marcus during a store visit that the wage increases meant he could finally start rebuilding his retirement savings. Linda, who had mobility issues, received the accommodations she had been requesting for years and was able to work without constant pain. Jorge used the educational assistance benefit to enroll in an intensive English program and began preparing to recertify his engineering credentials. These individual stories represented what was happening across the entire company. People were being given opportunities to build better lives. Marcus also reached back out to Catherine and her daughter. Catherine's daughter had recovered fully from her accident, and Catherine had tentatively decided to stay with Freshmart to see if the changes were real. Marcus invited Catherine to join an advisory council of frontline employees who would provide regular input on company policies and practices. The council would meet quarterly with Marcus and the chief people officer to discuss what was working and what still needed to change. Catherine accepted the invitation and became one of the most valuable voices on the council, never hesitating to challenge policies or call out inconsistencies between stated values and actual practices. Not every change went smoothly. Some managers who could not or would not adapt to the new culture left the company. Some veteran employees were skeptical and continued to expect the other shoe to drop, waiting for Marcus to announce that the experiment had failed and everything would revert to the old ways. Some customers complained about higher prices, as Freshmart passed some of the increased labor costs onto consumers. Competitors mocked Freshmart's approach, arguing that Marcus was running a charity instead of a business. But there were also early signs that the changes were working. Employee turnover dropped by 35% in the first quarter, saving millions in recruitment and training costs. Customer satisfaction scores improved as employees became more engaged and provided better service. Several stores reported that former employees were reapplying for positions, drawn back by word that Freshmart was now a decent place to work. Applications for open positions increased dramatically, allowing stores to be more selective in hiring and raising the overall quality of new employees. The financial results were mixed. Profit margins did decline as predicted, though not as severely as the CFO had feared. Some of the increased labor costs were offset by efficiency gains from having experienced, engaged employees. Revenue actually increased slightly as better customer service attracted and retained more shoppers. The stock price took an initial hit when the reforms were announced, but stabilized as investors saw that the company was not collapsing. 3 months after implementing the changes, Marcus presented the results to the board of directors. He showed them the employee data, lower turnover, higher engagement, improved morale. He showed them the customer data, better satisfaction scores, increased loyalty, positive word of mouth. He showed them the financial data. Yes, profit margins were lower, but revenue was up and the company was positioned for sustainable long-term growth rather than short-term extraction. He also shared stories. He told them about Patricia and James, good managers who now had the resources to do their jobs properly. He told them about Susan, who had been ready to quit, but now loved her work. He told them about Raymond and Linda and Jorge and Catherine and dozens of others whose lives had been changed by Freshmart's new approach. He reminded them that the company was not just a financial instrument, but a community of people, and that its ultimate success depended on the well-being of that community. The board meeting was less contentious than the previous one, though still not unanimous. The directors who had opposed Marcus's reforms remained skeptical, arguing that 3 months was too short a time frame to judge success, and that the long-term financial impact remained uncertain. But enough board members were convinced by the early results to give Marcus more time. The probationary period was extended for another 6 months, with quarterly reviews. Marcus accepted these terms and returned to the work of transformation. He knew that changing a company's culture was not accomplished in a few months. It would take years of consistent effort, of constantly reinforcing values through actions, of holding people accountable when they fell short. But he was committed to seeing it through. He had witnessed the human cost of his company's failures. He had promised employees that things would change. He would not break that promise. Over the following year, Marcus continued to visit stores regularly, often unannounced, to observe operations and talk with employees. He maintained the habit he had developed during his undercover work of actually listening to what people told him, of paying attention to what was happening rather than just accepting what managers reported. He discovered that this level of engagement, while time-consuming, was essential to understanding the real state of the business. He also discovered talents and potential in unexpected places. Denise, the single mother working 2 jobs, was given additional training and promoted to department supervisor. Her lived experience of struggling to balance work and family made her particularly effective at managing schedules and supporting employees through personal difficulties. Terrence, the aspiring basketball player, received educational assistance to attend college while working part-time at Freshmart. When injuries ended his athletic dreams, he shifted his focus to business studies and eventually joined the company's management training program. Keisha, the college student whose education had been disrupted by erratic scheduling, graduated with honors and was hired into Freshmart's corporate marketing department. She brought a frontline perspective that was invaluable in developing campaigns and initiatives. Miguel, the immigrant engineer, completed his English studies and recertified his credentials. He moved into a role in Freshmart's facilities planning department, where his engineering expertise was finally recognized and utilized. These success stories became the norm rather than the exception. When employees were treated with dignity, given opportunities, and supported in their development, they flourished. Many chose to build long-term careers with Freshmart rather than viewing it as a temporary stopgap. The company's reputation as an employer improved dramatically, making it easier to attract talented people at all levels. The transformation of Freshmart also attracted attention from other companies and industry observers. Several retail CEOs reached out to Marcus to ask about his experience and the results he was seeing. Some were genuinely interested in implementing similar changes in their own companies. Others were skeptical but curious. A few were openly critical, arguing that Marcus was setting unrealistic expectations for the entire industry. Marcus was generous in sharing what he had learned. He wrote articles about his experience and spoke at industry conferences. He was honest about the challenges and the costs, but he was also clear about the benefits. He argued that the retail industry's race to the bottom on labor costs was destructive for everyone involved, and that there was a better way. Some listeners were persuaded. Many remained unconvinced. But the conversation had begun, and that was progress. A year after implementing his reforms, Marcus appeared on a national news program to discuss the Freshmart transformation. The interviewer asked him if he regretted the decision to go undercover, given the deception involved and the pain of what he had witnessed. Marcus thought carefully before responding. He said that he did regret the deception and the pain, but he did not regret the decision itself. Going undercover had been necessary to see the truth, and seeing the truth had been necessary to fix the problems. If he had to do it over again, he would make the same choice. The interviewer asked if the changes had been worth it financially. Marcus responded that it was too early to know for certain, but the early indicators were positive. More importantly, though, he had come to believe that measuring success purely in financial terms was a mistake. A company's success should be measured by the well-being it created for all stakeholders: employees, customers, communities, and, yes, shareholders too. Freshmart was creating more well-being now than it had before, and that made it more successful regardless of what the stock price said. At the end of the interviewer asked Marcus what advice he would give to other CEOs who wanted to understand their companies better. Marcus smiled and said that the best way to understand a company was to work in it, not to visit as the boss, surrounded by handlers and presentations, but to actually work alongside frontline employees, to experience what they experience, to see the company through their eyes. It was uncomfortable and humbling and often painful, but it was also essential. A CEO who did not understand the reality of their employees' lives could not possibly make good decisions about the company's future. The interview went viral and sparked widespread discussion about corporate leadership and responsibility. Some praised Marcus as a visionary. Others dismissed him as naive or called his approach unsustainable. But the conversation continued, and slowly, attitudes began to shift. Other companies started experimenting with similar programs, having executives work undercover or at least spend time working frontline positions. The results varied, but the common thread was that leaders who truly understood their organizations made better decisions. 2 years after his undercover operation, Marcus reflected on the journey during a quiet evening at home with Jennifer. Freshmart had continued to improve by almost every meaningful metric. Employee retention was at an all-time high. Customer satisfaction continued to climb. The company was opening new stores and expanding into new markets. Stock prices had recovered and were approaching their pre-reform levels. The board of directors, while not unanimous, was generally supportive. Critics who had predicted disaster had been proven wrong. But Marcus took the most pride in the individual stories. Employees like Catherine and Susan and Raymond and Denise had better lives because of the changes at Freshmart. Young people like Terrence and Keisha had opportunities they would not have had before. Managers like Patricia and James could do their jobs with integrity rather than being forced to choose between their values and their responsibilities. These human outcomes mattered more than any financial metric. Marcus also acknowledged that the work was not finished and never would be. Creating a healthy organizational culture required constant attention and effort. New problems would emerge. The company would face new challenges. There would be setbacks and failures along the way. But he was committed to continuing the journey, to remembering the lessons he had learned during those 8 weeks of working alongside his employees. He established a tradition that every member of his executive team would spend at least 1 week per year working in stores, not as visiting executives, but as regular employees. They would stock shelves, operate registers, clean bathrooms, and experience firsthand what they were asking others to do. Some executives embraced this enthusiastically. Others complained bitterly. But all of them came back with better understanding and perspective. Marcus himself continued the practice, spending 1 week every quarter working in a different store. He did not go undercover anymore. Everyone knew who he was. But that did not prevent him from doing the work and listening to what employees told him. These quarterly visits kept him grounded and connected to the reality of the business. They reminded him that behind every policy decision and financial report were real human beings whose lives would be affected. 5 years after the transformation began, Marcus attended a company gathering where long-term employees were recognized for their service. Catherine was among those being honored for 5 years with Freshmart. When she took the stage to receive her award, she spoke briefly about her experience. She talked about the day her daughter was in the hospital, about how that had represented the lowest point in her employment. She talked about how Marcus's reforms had changed everything, how she now felt valued and respected, how Freshmart had become a company she was proud to work for. She also thanked Marcus directly for having the courage to see the company as it truly was and to make it better. She said that she had been skeptical at first, that she had not believed the changes would last, that she had expected everything to revert to the old ways once the headlines faded. But Marcus had proven her wrong. He had kept his promises, and that had made all the difference. Marcus listened to Catherine's words with tears in his eyes. This was why he had endured those difficult 8 weeks undercover. This was why he had fought through the resistance and skepticism. This was why he had risked his position and reputation to do what was right. Companies were not just machines for generating profit. They were communities of people working together toward shared goals. When those communities functioned well, when people were treated with dignity and given opportunities to thrive, everyone benefited. The story of Marcus Williams and his undercover operation became something of a legend in the business world. It was studied in business schools as a case study in organizational transformation. It was debated by executives and consultants. It inspired some leaders to take similar journeys of discovery. It was dismissed by others as an outlier that could not be replicated. But for the 15,000 people who worked at Freshmart, it was simply the story of how their company had changed from a place that treated them as disposable resources to a place that valued them as human beings. It was the story of how one crying cashier had inadvertently sparked a transformation that improved thousands of lives. It was the story of how a leader had found the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and to act on them despite the costs and risks. And it was a reminder that behind every business statistic, every quarterly report, every stock price, there are real people whose lives depend on the decisions leaders make. Those decisions can either crush spirits and destroy potential, or they can lift people up and help them build better futures. The choice belongs to the leaders, and the consequences of that choice ripple outward in ways both visible and invisible, affecting communities, families, and individual lives in profound ways. Marcus Williams had made his choice. He had chosen to see the truth, even when it was painful. He had chosen to act on that truth, even when it was costly. He had chosen to put people before short-term profits, to invest in long-term sustainability rather than immediate gains. And, in making those choices, he had transformed not just his company, but also himself. Years later, when Marcus eventually stepped down as CEO to make room for the next generation of leadership, he looked back on his time at Freshmart with pride. He had built a successful business, yes, but, more importantly, he had built a community where people could work with dignity, support their families, pursue their dreams, and build better lives. He had created something that would endure beyond his tenure, a culture and a set of values that would continue to shape the company long after he was gone. On his final day as CEO, Marcus spent the morning working in a store, just as he had done quarterly for years. He stocked shelves, helped customers, and talked with employees. At the end of his shift, as he prepared to leave the store for the last time as CEO, he was approached by a young cashier who had been hired just a few months earlier. She told him she had heard stories about what Freshmart used to be like before his reforms, about how employees had been treated poorly and managers had been abusive. She thanked him for creating a company where she felt valued and respected, where she could work without fear, where she had opportunities to grow and build a career if she chose. Marcus thanked the young cashier and walked out to his car, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with quarterly reports that showed something was wrong. It had continued with a decision to see the truth for himself rather than relying on filtered information. It had required 8 weeks of difficult, sometimes painful experiences. It had demanded courage to confront powerful interests and implement sweeping changes. But it had resulted in a company that was better in every meaningful way. As Marcus drove away from the store, he thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by the transformation of Freshmart. He thought about Sarah, whose public humiliation had been one of his first wake-up calls. He thought about Amber, who had been harassed and abandoned until the system changed. He thought about Catherine, whose tears had finally broken his silence. He thought about Susan and Patricia and James and Denise and Raymond and Linda and Jorge and Terrence and Keisha and countless others whose stories had shaped his understanding and guided his actions. Each of them had taught him something about leadership, about responsibility, about the difference between running a business and building a community. Each of them had shown him that behind every policy and every decision were real human consequences. Each of them had given him the courage to choose the harder but better path. The legacy Marcus Williams left behind was not measured in stock prices or market share or quarterly earnings, though Freshmart had succeeded by those measures too. His real legacy was in the thousands of people who worked for a company that treated them with dignity, who had opportunities to build better lives, who could support their families and pursue their dreams without sacrificing their well-being or their values. His legacy was in the culture he had rebuilt, in the values he had restored, in the promise that business could be both profitable and humane. And it had all started with one decision: to see the truth, whatever the cost. That decision had changed everything. For Marcus Williams, for Freshmart, and for every person whose life had been touched by a company that chose to value people over profits, compassion over efficiency, and long-term sustainability over short-term gains. The crying cashier had sparked a transformation that proved business could be different, could be better, could honor the humanity of everyone involved while still achieving success. That was the real story, not just about an undercover operation or corporate reforms, but about the power of one person choosing to see the truth and act on it, and the ripple effects that spread outward when leaders find the courage to do what is right rather than what is easy. In Cs, defined broadly to include family medical situations, natural disasters, and other acute crises, would be allowed to leave immediately without penalty. Managers would have discretion to grant emergency leave and would be evaluated on their judgment in using that discretion. The policy that had forced Catherine to work during her daughter's surgery was eliminated completely, and Marcus personally called Catherine to tell her so. He announced across-the-board wage increases. Starting pay would rise by 15% immediately, with additional increases phased in over the next year. The goal was to make Freshmart's wages competitive with other industries, not just other retailers. He wanted to attract people who chose to work at Freshmart because they wanted to, not because they had no other options. He expanded benefits. Part-time employees who worked at least 20 hours per week would now qualify for health insurance. The company would cover a larger percentage of premium costs. Mental health services would be included with no copay. Educational assistance would be provided for employees pursuing degrees or certifications, with higher amounts for fields related to retail management. He changed how store managers were evaluated. Financial metrics would remain important, but they would be balanced with employee satisfaction scores, retention rates, and assessments of workplace culture. Managers who hit their numbers while creating toxic environments would no longer be rewarded. Managers who invested in their people and created positive workplaces would be recognized and promoted, even if their short-term financial performance was slightly lower. Each of these changes came with a significant price tag. The CFO calculated that the total cost of Marcus's proposed reforms would reduce profit margins by approximately 18% in the first year. This would translate to tens of millions of dollars in reduced profitability. Shareholders would not be happy. Stock prices would likely decline. Analysts would downgrade their ratings. Marcus would face intense pressure to reverse course. But Marcus had made his decision. He announced the changes in a company-wide video message that went out to all 15,000 employees. He was honest about what he had done and what he had learned. He apologized for losing sight of the values that had founded Freshmart. He acknowledged that his company had failed its employees in fundamental ways. And he promised that things would change, starting immediately. He invited employees to hold him accountable, to use the new communication channels to report problems and propose solutions, to help rebuild Freshmart into a company they could be proud to work for. Susan was skeptical. She had worked for Freshmart long enough to see multiple corporate initiatives that promised change but delivered nothing. She had heard executives talk about putting people first while simultaneously cutting labor hours and eliminating benefits. She would believe Marcus's promises when she saw actual results, not before. Marcus understood her skepticism and respected it. He did not ask her to trust him based on words alone. He asked her to give him 90 days to prove through actions that he meant what he said. If after 90 days nothing had changed, she could walk away with no hard feelings. Susan agreed to give him that chance. Before leaving Store 72, Marcus visited Catherine at her home. He called ahead to make sure she was willing to see him, and when she answered the door, he could see the confusion on her face. She knew him as Marcus Johnson, her co-worker, but here he was showing up at her house unannounced. Marcus asked if he could come in, and Catherine, though hesitant, agreed. He sat in Catherine's modest living room and revealed his true identity. Like Susan, Catherine cycled through disbelief and shock. But, unlike Susan, she also became angry. She felt violated, like she had been tricked. She had confided in Marcus Johnson, had shared her pain and vulnerability with someone she thought was a peer. Now she learned that he had actually been the CEO, that everything had been observed, and recorded for some corporate purpose she could not understand. Marcus let her vent her anger without interruption. He deserved it. He had deceived her and everyone else he had worked with over the past 8 weeks. When Catherine finally ran out of words, Marcus apologized sincerely. He explained why he had gone undercover, what he had learned, and what he planned to do about it. He told her that watching her be forced to work while her daughter was in surgery had been the moment he decided he could no longer remain silent, that her suffering had catalyzed the changes he was about to implement. Susan seemed like a decent person, but she was completely overwhelmed. She was the only member of management at the store, responsible for everything from scheduling to inventory to customer service to maintenance. She worked 6 days a week, often 12-hour shifts, and was on call for emergencies on her day off. She looked perpetually exhausted and defeated. When Marcus asked about assistant managers or department supervisors, Susan laughed bitterly and explained that corporate had eliminated those positions at smaller stores 2 years ago as a cost-cutting measure. She was now doing the work that used to be distributed among 4 people. The other employees at Store 72 were struggling in their own ways. Marcus met Raymond, a man in his late 50s who had worked in manufacturing for 30 years before his plant closed. He had been searching for comparable work for 2 years before accepting this job at Freshmart, taking a 60% pay cut in the process. He talked about his previous job with nostalgia and pain, about the pride he had felt in his work, about the good wages that had allowed him to support his family and save for retirement. Now he was stocking shelves for minimum wage, his retirement savings long depleted, working alongside his own daughter who had also been unable to find better employment. He met Linda, a woman with mobility issues who walked with a cane and struggled with the physical demands of retail work. She had requested accommodations multiple times through proper channels, but her requests had been denied or ignored. She was often assigned to tasks she physically could not perform, then was criticized for not working fast enough. She lived in constant fear of being fired, but could not afford to quit because she needed the health insurance the job provided to help pay for her medications. He met Jorge, an immigrant whose limited English had prevented him from finding better opportunities despite being highly educated in his home country. Jorge had been an engineer before coming to America. Here he cleaned bathrooms and mopped floors, his intelligence and education wasted because of language barriers and lack of recognition for foreign credentials. He took English classes at night, trying to improve his opportunities, but the erratic scheduling at Freshmart made consistent attendance difficult. See his face and knew something terrible had happened. They sat together in the kitchen, and Marcus told her everything. He told her about the working conditions, about the low morale, about managers who treated employees like criminals, and corporate policies that valued efficiency over humanity. He told her about Sarah, about watching a young woman be destroyed in public while he stood by and did nothing. Jennifer held his hand and reminded him that he was doing this for a reason, that he could not fix the problem until he fully understood it, that the temporary pain of watching would lead to permanent change. But Marcus went to bed that night feeling like a coward and a fraud. The next morning, Marcus learned that Sarah had quit. She had turned in her vest and name tag at the end of her shift and walked out. Nobody seemed surprised. Employee turnover at this store was so high that people barely noticed when someone left. There would be another body to replace her within a day or two, another desperate person willing to accept poor treatment for a small paycheck. Marcus continued working at store 214 for 2 more weeks. In that time, he witnessed countless small cruelties and indignities. He saw employees denied bathroom breaks during long shifts. He saw workers called in on their days off and threatened with termination if they refused. He saw people forced to work while sick because they could not afford to lose hours. He saw favoritism, discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And through it all, he saw corporate policies that he himself had approved being twisted and weaponized by managers who cared only about their own advancement. But he also saw moments of humanity that gave him hope. He saw employees helping each other through difficult shifts, covering for one another, sharing food when someone had forgotten lunch. He saw Denise slip money to Miguel when his car broke down. He saw Robert teach a new employee the tricks that made the work a little easier. He saw Keisha stand up to a customer who was berating a teenage bagger. These people, despite everything working against them, still had dignity and compassion. They still cared about each other even when management did not care about them. On his last day at store 214, Marcus was called into Carol's office. He assumed she had discovered his identity or was firing him for some made-up reason. Instead, she told him he was being transferred to store 163, about 40 miles away, because they were short-staffed and needed help immediately. When Marcus asked if he had any choice in the matter, Carol looked at him like he had asked the most ridiculous question imaginable. Of course he had no choice. He worked for Freshmart. He went where they told him to go, or he found a different job. It was that simple. Marcus accepted the transfer and prepared to move to his next location, wondering what fresh nightmares awaited him there.